I put out this riff on my channel a couple of weeks ago, and I thought this would be a really good one to talk about how much the drums can change a riff. This riff is all in 4/4, pretty straightforward from a rhythmic perspective, and I want to show you how much the drums can transform a riff like this into something totally different. So I'm not going to change the guitar or bass at all. It's all the original recording. I'm just copying it and pasting it over into different spots. And then we'll take a look at the drums and a bunch of different ways that you can make a riff like this sound completely different. So here's the drum part I actually used on this riff. There's a couple things I'm trying to do here. One is to hit some of those accents of the riff, so where there's certain high notes, I'm hitting with snare drums and with cymbals. I'm also changing up the grooves a bit from like halftime feels to double time. There's some tom work covering places. I do a little bit of a weird kind of almost metric modulation sort of a thing on top, or like a rhythmic illusion thing on top with the cymbals at the end, which I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm kind of combining all of these different ideas to bring about some extra life from this riff. So the parts where I'm hitting with the riff kind of keeps everything in sync, and then it goes into double time, gives it a lot more energy. Obviously I have the kick drum going along with all those gallops and all the faster parts too. I have big fills going with the guitars in places too. All of that is really helping to make the riff kind of stand out a little bit more and add a lot of extra life to it, as opposed to just keeping like a really steady kind of straightforward rock beat. So here's a much simpler example. In this case, the snare drum's hitting on beat 3 every single time, creating a halftime groove. Although at this faster tempo, it doesn't really feel so much like a halftime groove, more kind of just a straightforward groove. And I'm still keeping all the kick drums the same, following the riff. There are some fills and cymbal hits here as well, but take a listen to how different this riff sounds now. Much more straightforward, kind of a little easier to groove along with in some cases, but it also sounds maybe a little bit stale and boring. And I would never really do something like this the entire time, right? This is something I would use occasionally, and in fact, in my original version, I do have kind of that halftime groove happening somewhere near the end of the riff. But it's just an example of more of a straightforward kind of way of writing a beat. And sometimes that makes a lot more sense. Depending on the riff, depending on the section, sometimes you need just that straight backbeat, really solid, just locking you into that tempo. So it's not a terrible option here. Obviously, I wouldn't use it the entire time, but it's just an example of one other way you could do this. This next example is along the same lines, but this time I'm going to do a double time groove, meaning the snare is going to hit on beats 2 and 4 in every single measure. This is going to give the riff a little bit more energy, but I'm still keeping the kick drums the same following the riff. Here we go. It really is amazing how much just changing that snare placement changes the riff. Now that second half feels like much faster and intense, whereas it felt more kind of heavy and groovy in the original version and in the halftime version, because I use kind of a halftime groove in my original riff. I do love this double time groove on that first riff though, right? It feels really nice to have that faster beat happening over the beginning riff. So let's combine those two ideas together. In this example, I'm going to do double time in the first half of the riff where it's faster. And then when it gets to that harmonic section, the second half of the riff, it's going to go to halftime. So this is still a simple example. It's simpler than my original version. I don't have the sort of weird snare hits, and there's less of the fills and kind of following the riff. But this is going to be much more effective in a more straightforward way. I'm going to double time and then halftime. So let's check it out. So when I'm helping people write drum parts to begin with to go along with their music, assuming they're not using a real drummer who's going to come up with parts on their own, I often emphasize just this simple idea of changing the overall groove in spots, right? That simple move of going from double time to halftime makes a massive difference in this riff, and each one of those has a different feel. So as a composer, I can think about, okay, what do I want in this particular part of this riff or of this song? Do I want that more aggressive driving double time, or do I want the slower feeling of the halftime? And I can go back and forth. And, I could go back and forth a lot in some cases, but I'm going to kind of really try to draw out these different feelings by using these different drum grooves. So far in all of these examples, I've had the kick drum follow the riff exactly. So doing all of the gallops and hitting all of the parts, all of the 16th notes and all of the breaks. That works super well, and that ends up being my default usually with these kind of more technical sounding riffs. But you can have the kick drum do different things, right? Something much more straightforward. There's a couple of different things happening in this next example, much more straightforward ideas. One of them is the Lars Ulrich, which is just kick, snare. That sounds like this. There's also the double time Lars Ulrich, so kick, snare, kick, snare. That happens next. And this kind of stuff works really well in some cases. I think about Mike Portnoy, for example. He uses that a lot in certain, Dream Theater sections. The other thing you can do, instead of following the riff with your kick drums, with your double kick drums, is just have them go straight. So you can do straight 8th notes with the double kick, or I can do straight 16th notes. So I have both of those in here too. Or this example here, which has snares on every beat and then straight 16th notes. Much more straightforward, but it can add a lot of energy. So this example does all of those sorts of things in different ways. And I do kind of mix in some of those different snare placements here as well. So let's listen to how this example sounds. Really cool and very different, but it still works fairly well. So much of that is really cool, and that sort of basic Lars Ulrich, just one kick drum happening, actually leaves a lot of space for the guitars to kind of shine a little bit more. You know, I'm not doubling up every single little nuance of the guitar with the kick drum. In some cases, that can be really cool. I also really like the straight 16th note running there too. It gives a ton of energy and aggression to parts. So you can kind of do a mix of both too. And sometimes when I'm writing drum parts, I might do that where I'll have the kick drum follow the riff exactly in some cases, and then other places it might just run straight 16th notes or do more of a straightforward groove. So kind of mixing and matching these things together works really well. And you can tell in this case, I also mixed up those snare placements too. So kind of combining some of the earlier ideas with this more straightforward kick drum idea. I got to editing the video and I entirely missed one of the grooves here. I think because it's pretty straightforward. This is the extreme metal groove. So a bunch of blast beats and a lot more double kick, but it's still a really nice sound over this riff. So let's check it out. So now I want to go back to my original groove and talk about some of the things I did in there that relate to the things I just mentioned. And then I want to take a look at one last crazy example I put together, which has a bunch of these weird, almost metric modulation sorts of things, but still kind of works. So here's my original groove again. In the first part, I have snare drums following the riff. So any of these higher moments in the riff, you can hear the snare drum is hitting those and accenting those. I have the cymbals doing the same thing too, accenting parts of the riff. So here we have this big hit on the end of 4. Right? And then there it goes to more of a straightforward backbeat here on beat 3, there, and then some more hits following. And then we go into a double time in the second half of this first riff. And then we have more of this straightforward drum groove, kind of what I was talking about before, was just like snare, kick, snare, kick, snare, kick. So mixing a little bit of that in there as well. So we have snare drums following, and then we have kind of a halftime groove with some snare hits following at the end. Then you have a double time groove, and then you have more of a straightforward snare on each beat, kick drum just in between. And then there are cymbal hits kind of happening in between. So let's take a listen. The other thing to talk about is what the cymbals are doing, because that's what's giving you your pulse throughout this whole riff. Now, during this first half, it's almost all just quarter notes on like a hi-hat, besides the cymbal hits here and there. But I do a little bit of a different thing here at the end of this first part of the riff. I follow these kind of groups of 5 that happen in the riff. So the cymbals go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, kind of inside of this 4/4, right? If we listen to this. Right. Catching those parts of the riff, in this case with the snare drum and with the cymbals. So you can really get kind of crazy with the cymbals, and I do a little bit of that in this second half, and I'm really going to do that in this last example I'll show you later. So let's take a listen to this second half. Here I go for that straightforward halftime backbeat, and the cymbals change too as well to catch that halftime groove. So now we have cymbals every half note instead of on every quarter note. And then we have some tom work here. So I'm going to catch these faster runs, in this case with the toms, although there's kick drums going with it too. But kind of using some of the other drums too, not just kick, snare, cymbals. So we're going to have like cymbal hits between these tom runs, and the tom runs are following these harmonics that are happening in the guitar. So at the end here we have this weird thing, it's almost like a metric modulation, rhythmic illusion kind of an idea, where the cymbals are going to hit every 3rd, 8th note, and the snare drum is kind of follow that as well. You're going to kind of get this almost weird triplet feel just for the last little section of the riff. So here's this whole second half of the riff. Halftime groove. Toms. Metric modulation. So all of those things help to make this riff sound really interesting in the second half. So it's a little more straightforward in the first half, more of a kind of steady pulse throughout, and then I kind of break up that steady pulse a little bit in the second half, especially towards the end. So let's listen to this whole thing again, keeping all of those things in mind as we listen to the drums specifically. And this is what I ended up settling on for this particular riff. There's enough interesting stuff happening in the drums to keep the riff entertaining and different as it goes along, but I'm also not taking away from the riff itself, right? The drums are interacting with the bass and guitars in cool ways. I'm really thinking about how can I blend all of these parts together. So it sounds interesting. It's not just a straightforward backbeat, but you have some of those cool drum elements in there as well. So some interesting, fills and weird grooves and all of that. And it feels like it's really complementing the riff and kind of making the riff better. And that's really what you want with drum grooves in general, is you want them to make the rest of the music sound better. So make your riffs sound better and your melodies and all of that. And there's so much you can do with that. And I'm not a drummer myself, right? I'm just kind of studied a lot of drums over the years to kind of figure out some of these ideas. But just even learning a little bit from even a video like this or just listening to your favorite drummers, you can really kind of make your music stand out a little bit more just by changing up the drums. So let's take a look at this really crazy last example here. So this last example is completely crazy and over the top. I went as far as I could with some of these weird rhythmic ideas. I'm just going to let it play, and then I'm going to try to explain some of the things I was doing here. So as you can tell, all sorts of crazy stuff happening in there. But the riff itself doesn't change at all. You get these crazy different feels throughout. And this is pretty over the top and kind of an extreme example. I would probably only do like some of these things here and there. Like for example, in my actual groove, I did just a tiny bit of this weird kind of metric stuff happening at the very end. So this is kind of an extreme example pushed all the way to the max. But I'm doing a couple of interesting things here, and some of them sound really cool, particularly these first couple ones. So right off the bat, what I'm doing is taking this riff that's in 4/4, and I'm basically almost treating it like 12/8. So now we have groups of 3/8 notes, right, with the snare backbeat. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, da, 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 da. And even that simple metric modulation there is really interesting, can provide a lot of cool ideas to your riffs. Sometimes taking a riff in 4/4 and like putting this triplet kind of feel, 12/8 feel on top of it can be really interesting. And I think in this particular case, you kind of get those gallops in different spots and the groove starts to interact differently with the beat here. It makes me kind of want to write a 12/8 version of this riff. When I do this sort of thing, I might actually take a riff and then kind of change it a little bit to fit entirely into 12/8 if I wanted sort of a different feel with the same riff. But this works super well in this particular case. And then the next part, I have some implied odd time signatures. So the drums do what are basically groups of 7, so like 7/8, and then groups of 5, 5/8. So 2 groups of 7/8. And then 2 groups of 5/8. But you can see that's actually starting on beat 2 of the 4/4, and that interacts with the riff in a really interesting way. Now the riff here, which is this measure 239 in this case, the riff itself does this group of 5. So in that case, this 5/8 is kind of syncing up with that. But before this, it interacts in a weird way, this 7/8 idea with the riff itself. So if we listen here with the band. But it's really interesting. I'm sort of hiding these odd time signature ideas inside of 4/4. And this part of this arrangement I actually think is pretty cool. So you have this kind of implied 12/8 and then these implied 7/8 and 5/8 here. But it works really well. I actually really like that 7/8 and 5/8 kind of part there with the sort of Neil Peart like bell in there as well. Next we have this section where I'm implying almost quintuplets. So the cymbals are going to hit every 5/8 notes, going to make it feel like beats of 5, right, or quintuplet beats. And then the snare drum's hitting, on 2 and 4 within those groups of 5. And then I sync it back up when it gets to those hits. Right? That's kind of the idea there. Really interesting. It almost makes it feel like the riff is slowing down. And once again, the riff starts to interact differently with that groove once you get there. Now this one, I don't even know exactly what I was doing. I think it was another 7 thing, like a 7/16 in this case. Listen to just the drums. Almost like this weird messed up breakbeat thing. It's like groups of 7 in the cymbals. And so that takes place over 7 beats here, right? Because it's starting on beat 2. Kind of similar to what I did with the 7/8 earlier, but now it's a 7/16. I kept the snares on the beat to kind of make it feel a little bit less awkward, but this is definitely weird. But it kind of works in like a really odd way. I might want to adjust the drums a little bit there, but it works okay. And then you have kind of groups of 5, right, in the toms, just following the riff again, which is grouped in 5s. Now, in the second half of the riff, I do a couple of really weird things. What I'm doing here is basically changing where we're feeling this halftime groove. Normally, you'd feel a halftime groove on beats 1 and 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So in this case, I'm going to shift that to beats 2 and 4. So it starts on 1 and 3 in the first measure and then hits beat 4 here. And then from there, it's accenting beats 4 and 2. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm changing the snare hits to also follow that. This is something I heard Gavin Harrison do originally. Basically, I'm offsetting the beat. So we keep the same riff, but now instead of the snare drums and cymbals hitting on 1 and 3, they're hitting on 2 and 4, and it creates this weird, awkward kind of rhythm. It almost feels like there was an odd time signature thrown in there somewhere, but it's all still in 4/4. So let's take a listen to this. And that is completely wild and really throws off the original riff, but it sounds really cool. And in this case, I actually think works really well. Something I might actually incorporate into this riff if I was to use it in more of a full song. So it's a really complicated idea, but in this case, very interesting. In this last part, there's some more metric modulations. And this is kind of similar to the part earlier where it was grouped in 5s, almost creating this quintuplet feel. But here it's 5s with a halftime groove. So you're going to get 2 simple hits that are 5/8 notes long each, and then the snare. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Something like that. So I'm going to start that metric modulation on beat 3, and then from there there's 15 beats, quarter note beats left in the measure. So that's going to line up with groups of 5. There's a lot of math involved there, but this is how that sounds. So all of those things combined, we've got the 12/8 modulation. You have these time signatures inside of 4/4, 7/8, 5/8. You have this quintuplet kind of groove. You have this really weird 7/16 thing. You have the offsetting rhythms, and then you have the halftime quintuplet thing. And all of that combines. So that's pretty crazy for a riff that never leaves 4/4. And in fact, this riff is in, bars of 8 and 16. So really normal phrase lengths, all in 4/4. But this usage of the weird rhythmic stuff can make the sound so much different. And this is like a super extreme example. This is not terribly musical in a lot of cases. Some of the stuff is cool, but a lot of it is really too much and over the top. And I would use some of these ideas sparingly as I'm writing. But it's just an example of how much I can change a riff like this with the drums. This doesn't even feel like the same riff at all, right? It feels like some sort of crazy prog thing where like the time signatures are just changing all over the place, but it's all just 4/4. It's just some drum trickery kind of happening within there. So now I'm going to play this original video that I made for this riff. I'm going to put all of these drum grooves back to back so you can see how different they are. So we'll do my original drum groove, and then the double time and halftime one, and then the sort of basic Lars Ulrich, really simple kick drum idea one, and then this crazy metric modulation groove. That way you can hear how different this riff sounds with all of these different grooves happening underneath it. So there's some simple ideas of ways you can use drum grooves to change your riff. I've done a couple of lessons on drum grooves in the past, one on just sort of building basic grooves and the kind of different grooves you can use, as well as one about programming drums. I'll link those down below if you want to check those out. But I wanted to take a riff of my own, one that I did recently, and kind of just try some different drum stuff over it and see how it felt. When I'm writing, I spend a ton of time on the drum grooves trying to figure out what's going to really make this particular part sound the best, and how can I change things and make the energy feel different and give this riff a different mood. The drums have so much power over that. So when you're writing your riffs or writing songs, really pay attention to what the drums are doing and experiment with some different ideas and see what you can get out of it. So if you enjoyed this lesson, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share, all of that stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Till then, stay proggy.